Thank you for clicking on the video, and I hope everyone is doing really well. When it comes to eating disorders, there is a long list of rules and regulations and do's and don'ts, and we convince ourselves that we can live like that. Having an eating disorder develops unhealthy habits in our lives, and clearly those unhealthy habits haven't been working for you. They have left you alone and hungry and miserable. And for most days, you probably feel like you have to convince yourself that you feel great. Convince yourself that, yeah, I can live like this forever. Deep down, you know you can't. You know you're dying, and you know that you're losing this fight. Recovery offers you a change, a chance to try something different. Because obviously, the way you have been living isn't really living at all. Eating disorders are tricky. They often go undiagnosed or the symptoms are ignored, making eating disorders the mental disorder that claims the most lives. Eating disorders cross over between categories. What I mean by that is eating disorders can fall under three categories: physical disorder, mental disorder, and addiction. Illnesses that fall within these three categories have very different ways of treatment. This makes treating an eating disorder so much more difficult because you have to determine which category or which aspect of the eating disorder holds priority. In my opinion, I believe that all three categorizations are equal to one another and should be treated simultaneously. If you treat one aspect of an eating disorder but neglect the other aspects, it makes it so much harder to treat those aspects when the time comes. If you treat the mental part of the eating disorder in the same way that you treat an addiction, by making small physical changes, then you are actually treating all three aspects of the eating disorder at once. If you view this cycle of treatment as kind of like a flow chart, it creates a circle as one aspect moves into the next aspect, creating recovery. I think there is a very big emphasis on the eating part of an eating disorder, and I feel like the disorder part of the eating disorder is neglected. What really helped me, and I think would be very beneficial for a lot of people who are choosing recovery, is when you enter into recovery, initially you need to remove eating and food from the equation. Just at the beginning, it'll come back into play later, but you need to really focus on the disorder part of this problem, because it's not about food and it's not about eating. Food is just a tool, a means to an end, a means of control. What we really need to ask ourselves is, what are we trying to control? The answer is obviously our lives. You then have to go and ask yourself, well, why do I feel like my life is out of control? And there lies the cause of the eating disorder. Once you know the cause, it makes it so much easier to kind of grow from that and figure out your next plan of action for recovery. We must be aware of the cause in order to recover. I feel like there is such a lack of self-awareness when it comes to mental illness and trying to overcome mental illness. Eating disorders are no different. As we discover what it is from our past that has led us to our current state, and we start to recognize the choices that we have made that have distanced ourselves from our true self, the more recovery becomes, I would say, natural. Recovery becomes more natural because we are becoming more self-aware. As we become more self-aware, we are able to separate ourselves from the disorder and start to recognize us as who we truly are, us as a person who is free from the eating disorder. Something that I have come to believe wholeheartedly over the past couple of years when I consciously, seriously chose recovery for myself is, and I don't know where this kind of thinking has come from. It definitely is a more modern societal way of thinking, and we're always looking for someone else to blame. We're always trying to shift the blame to other people. And honestly, there is only one person to blame when it comes to eating disorders, and that is ourselves. We have made choices that have led us to a disordered way of life. We need to stop deferring blame to everyone else for our issues. We need to ask ourselves and figure out, what are the choices and the mistakes that I have made that have put me where I am? Maybe someone hurt us or betrayed us in the most vulgar of ways, but we still made choices based off that experience. And those choices could either be positive or negative. If those choices have led us to an eating disorder, chances are those choices were negative. And speaking for myself, I can admit I have made some very, very poor choices in my life, but I chose to make them. They were my choices, but the silver lining is I still have a choice. Every single day when we wake up in the morning, we have a choice. We have the choice to live that day bettering ourselves and becoming a more authentic self, or you wake up in the morning and you have the choice to destroy yourself, to betray yourself. It's up to you how you live that day. Nobody else can make that choice for you. There can be factors and there can be impact from other people, but ultimately, you have the final say in how your life turns out. Take responsibility for your mistakes. I have made a lot of mistakes, and I used to blame it on my upbringing or people in my life or people hurting me. Everybody else was at fault, but I still made those mistakes. I was the active member of that mistake. It was me. It was on me. And now I take responsibility for the horrible things that I have done that have led me to where I currently am. You have to face the consequences. For me, my consequence was having a very disordered image of myself and having a disordered mentality. And now I am dealing with that. I am facing it and I am trying to change it. I used to think for a very long time that my eating disorder was everyone else's fault but my own. Like I couldn't help it. I was predestined to develop an eating disorder. And maybe in many ways I was conditioned to develop an eating disorder, but despite the abuse and betrayal that I experienced throughout my childhood and throughout my adult life, I still chose to then turn and abuse and betray myself. I did that. I chose to do those things to myself. I think in today's society, there is a lack of encouragement for us to take responsibilities for our own actions. There are way too many excuses given to avoid taking ownership of our mistakes. And this needs to stop. And it especially needs to stop for people who have eating disorders, because it holds you back. The inability to be self-aware and to take responsibility holds you back from truly recovering. It's scary, it is hard, and I might be harsh right now, but you have to be harsh on yourself a little bit, and you need to face yourself. I think for me, one of the scariest parts of recovery was having to face myself and realizing that I am not stuck. I have convinced myself that I am stuck, but I am not stuck. I can get out of this. I can change my entire life. Okay, so I basically destroyed myself for 21 years, but that doesn't mean the next 21 years have to be just as miserable. I can change this. And I want people to realize that they can change too. They can grow and become so much more real, especially real with themselves. And they can live a full life despite the years. It doesn't matter how long you've been trapped within an eating disorder. That ends now, and you have your whole life ahead of you. Why wouldn't you want to change for that? I'm sorry if that kind of just went all over the place, kind of ranting, But it's something that's on my mind, and it's something that I don't think is said enough. And I think there needs to be more serious and not just playing around, I'm in recovery and all this stuff. No, recovery is serious. It is your life on the line. So be serious about it. Anyway, that doesn't mean that you can't smile and laugh and joke too about it. I think the biggest takeaway from all this is if you haven't faced yourself, start to make the small changes and the steps toward facing yourself, because honestly, it does not happen overnight. You don't just wake up one morning and suddenly be like, I'm going to take responsibility for everything. It's hard. It's very hard. It's difficult. And I've been there, and I can tell you, once you've worked through that first step to take responsibility, it becomes a lot easier over time to take responsibility for your mistakes, for your choices. You need to realize that having an eating disorder has hurt other people in your life, and that is by your hand. So you need to then turn and take responsibility for that. There's a lot of responsibility when it comes to recovery. And I feel like people feel like that's a burden to have responsibility. No, it's not a burden. It's part of life. It's part of growing up. It's small changes, and just work towards being better, getting better. Anyway, thank you so much for clicking on the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up if it was helpful at all. For more videos about diets and eating disorders, especially with an emphasis on my experience and my journey throughout my eating disorder years and now my recovery years, please subscribe. If you have any questions or comments or anything at all, feel free to leave that down below, and I will see you next time.